Who takes over when a Roman emperor dies? The matter of succession during the imperial period was incredibly important, and despite the Romans having a particular disdain for the idea of being ruled by a king, the reality was that succession in the imperial system worked very similarly to that of a monarchy. If an emperor died without appointing an heir, and more than that, ensuring he was properly introduced and accepted by the main power brokers in Roman politics, the transition of power certainly didn't become a dignified constitutional process. It devolved into a power vacuum that often devolved into civil war. So the title of Caesar emerged as one way to manage this problem. It was a title that said, in very clear terms, this is the man who comes next, and I, the emperor, am personally ensuring he's being raised to be a decent leader. But that role was not the same under Augustus, under the Antonines, during the crisis period of Rome, or in the late Empire. As the imperial office changed, shifting from the first citizen to enlightened monarchs, to military dictators, to divine god emperors on earth, like in the late Empire, the position of Caesar, of heir, also shifted with that of the main emperor. And this is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to see the evolution of the title of Caesar and how it reflected on the coins we collect. And before we begin, let me know which is your favorite Caesar by leaving your comment in this video. Also, remember leaving a like, subscribing to our newsletter if you want to learn how to collect ancient coins, and consider joining our Patreon for some exclusive perks. And we begin with Augustus, the very first emperor. He was the one who turned the name Caesar from a family name into a more specific public position of this designated heir. The name of this title came from his legendary adoptive father, Julius Caesar. So Augustus himself, previously called Gaius Octavius, he changed his name when he became emperor to Imperator Caesar Augustus. You're seeing now this title spelled out in this lovely denarius of him, issued in the final years of his reign. It reads Caesar Augustus, once again his regnal name. Then we have Divi Filius, the son of a god. How interesting, a reference to the deified memory of Julius Caesar. And a smart move on his part to borrow a bit of his father's divine aura for himself. And finally, Pater Patria, father of the nation, another honorific title bestowed upon him by the Roman Senate. You will see many emperors throughout the imperial period retaining the name Caesar in their official regnal name, but Augustus initially intended to use this name as a public indication that this person that received this name was being groomed by the emperor himself to succeed him. On the reverse of this denarius, we see what I mean here. At the center, we have two small figures. These are his adopted grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, biological sons of his most trusted general, Agrippa. Their names were changed to Gaius and Lucius Caesar. We can see it at the bottom part of this reverse under the two figures. We have the inscription Gaius et Lucius Caesares. And then their proclamation as imperial heirs continues along the borders, reading Augusti Fili, son of the emperor, consul designatio, designated consuls. That means when this coin was issued, they were indicated to the position of consuls, so show that they were already being given important official positions to ensure they were accustomed to the administrative tasks Roman demand from its leaders. And finally, Principi Juventutis. This is another very interesting title, that of the princeps. So, since Augustus could not openly found a monarchy, a royal line without provoking Rome's very touchy republican elite and its disdain for totalitarian rulers, he chose to, how may I put it, to package these heirs, this new dynasty, into titles that had more of a republican tone. Augustus did not publicly style himself as an emperor in the way we think of it today. He called himself the princeps, the first man in the state. Not a king, he was the primus inter pares, the first among equals, and he gave his heirs a similar title, but with an added suffix that showed they were directly subject to the princeps. They were instead the princeps Juventutis, the first of the youth. This wasn't an executive position with actual power, but it showed they were deeply involved into the power structure of the Roman state, at least in theory, and they were being raised to be a full princeps in the future. This, I love this type of tact, of political intelligence when creating these titles, shows just how Augustus was a political genius. He understood how the Roman sensibilities worked, and to a traditional Roman conservative, this looked like just the next generation of aristocrats being prepared within the Republic. But to anyone with a more pragmatic view, it also looked very much like a carefully staged line of succession. And this system worked. As we go to the next coin, which was issued at the 2nd century AD, we have the imperial system already very well established. But Rome had learned the hard way what happened when an emperor tried to rule like an isolated autocrat in a system that was supposed to be still a republic with multiple power players. Emperor Domitian had a very tense relationship with the Senate, and his very personal style of power, he wanted to rule by himself, ended with his assassination and the very nervous senatorial class suddenly back in charge. And they knew they had a new system, and this system, with a dead emperor, represented a power vacuum that was on their hands. So the army, as well as the rest of the Roman elites, they would certainly be looking for an opportunity to seize power and install their own new emperors. They could not afford a civil war to break out. And in response, Nerva, an elderly senator, was elevated to emperor. Now, no one expected him to rule for very long, and he didn't. He died a little over a year after becoming emperor. He was a compromise, a transitional emperor to a different, more adaptable model of power. The emperor would still be the central figure, but instead of simply handing the purple to a biological son, like in previous dynasties, he would choose the best man from the Roman elite and adopt him as his son and heir, giving him the title of Caesar. In practice, this meant looking to the top ranks of the aristocracy and the military, men who, already had command experience, connections, very good connections, and ideally the respect of both the Senate and the army, and knew how to communicate within these power brokers. And this adopted system worked wonderfully. For most of the 2nd century, a remarkably stable sequence of rulers, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, later remembered as the 5 good emperors. It was not a formal constitution. There was nowhere written that there would be this kind of adoptive monarchy, but the system produced a line of fairly competent leaders. And this idea worked very well. You get all of the Roman elites together, the top ranks of the army, the aristocracy, and the republican elites, and amongst them, sort of like curate, just like we curate our own coin collections, curate who was to be the best emperor and prepare this person while the previous emperor was still alive. And this man received the title of Caesar. Here, let me show an example. This is a coin from this century. I'm actually going to start from the reverse this time, because here we have a portrait of a Caesar, an 18-year-old Marcus Aurelius. This coin was issued in 140 AD. Marcus was the textbook example of a groomed heir. Hadrian wanted him as his successor, but around the time when Hadrian died, Marcus was just a little bit too young to handle this kind of responsibility. So Hadrian adopted a very capable Roman aristocrat, the man we know today as Antoninus Pius, as a kind of a stopgap, demanding Antoninus in turn to adopt Marcus. This way it was guaranteed that Marcus would eventually become an emperor. Hadrian probably didn't expect Antoninus to live very long, but he did. He lived for another 23 years, so Marcus had plenty of time to learn how to be an emperor. And lots of coins of Marcus Aurelius as a Caesar, not as an emperor, were also issued. They're relatively common in the market today. Marcus became famous for being this philosopher emperor. He was a great intellectual, and I think we can see that reflected on his coins. You get an air of seriousness, despite, as we can see here, the coin clearly depicting him almost like a young boy, although even if he was an adult when this coin was made. So, Here we can already see his titles on the legends, advertising his new regnal name and showing that from a very young age he was already being entrusted with important responsibilities. So here it reads Aurelius Caesar, his regnal name, and then Augustus Pii Filius, or son of the Emperor Pius. So a reference to his adopted father, Antoninus Pius. And finally, Cos, consul. Imagine that, being declared consul at only 18 years of age. The decades-long investment on Marcus ended up giving good fruits, because when he became emperor in 161, and a series of important challenges dumped all at once in Rome, from renewed wars on the frontiers to a plague, Marcus was actually a very responsible, very capable and dedicated emperor. As for the obverse of the coin, we have another portrait, now of the ruling emperor Antoninus Pius. Nothing really out of the ordinary here compared to other coins of the time. We have a portrait of the emperor looking right, wearing a laurel crown, a symbol to distinguish him as the emperor. You might have noticed that the Caesars generally don't wear anything on their heads. And we have his regnal name, the titles he had at the time. Antoninus Augustus Pius, Pater Patriae, Tribunicia Potestate, Consul Tertium. So this was a coin issued when Antoninus was serving his third term as a consul, and Marcus as his first term. So it was a joint consulship between the two. Of course, Rome had two consuls at any given time. This joint consulship could have been like a good opportunity to present Marcus Aurelius to the greater part of the Roman aristocracy as the heir apparent. A way of telling everyone they were ruling as consuls together, and that this young man, the junior partner, was being personally prepared to assume the job of being an emperor once Antoninus was gone. Lovely coin, it gives a message of stability, something very typical for this time. But nothing good lasts forever. As we continue going forward in time, we get to the 3rd century. In this time, the old imperial order, that of the princeps, was now visibly breaking down. In this century, the army becomes the real power broker in the empire, and emperors now rose and fell on the loyalty of their troops, rather than on any senatorial consensus or this idea of an enlightened monarchy. So generals on the frontiers were proclaimed emperors by their legions. They continuously marched on Italy, toppled the incumbent, only to be overthrown in turn by the next ambitious commander. It was really a meat grinder of a century. The constant civil wars shattered political order, and the economy took a nosedive in such uncertain times, draining most tax revenue and pushing the imperial government into this permanent crisis mode. You will see it reflected on the coins. To keep as many soldiers paid and loyal, these short-lived rulers struck coin after coin, reducing the amount of fine silver on each coin in order to make as many coins as possible to pay as many troops as possible. We today call this phenomenon of reducing the fine content on these precious metal coins debasement. The previous denarius we saw had around 80% silver content in it, while the coin we're about to see, it's down to around 40%, perhaps less, and it would get much, much worse. Inflation would actually ravage the already disabled Roman economy. And here we have a coin showing an example of one of the many Caesars of this period, Herennius Etruscus. Very minor historical character, and he fits perfectly in this time of improvised dynasties. Herennius was raised to the rank of Caesar in 250 as the elder son of Trajan Decius. The young man was presented alongside his father to the troops. He probably wasn't older than 20, he was most likely a teenager in fact, and he was displayed close to his father as the first successor of a, hopefully, permanent new dynasty, but different from the Caesars of the 2nd century, who actually held real power and were helpers of the senior emperors. Marcus Aurelius, for example, was basically the right hand of Antoninus Pius for a very long time. During the 3rd century, Caesars like Herennius here, they were frankly nothing but figureheads for their father's authority. We can see that reflected on the coins, where you don't see any kinds of public positions held by these young men. So here we can read his regnal name, Quintus Herennius Etruscus Messius Decius. no official titles. And then at the end, nobilicimus Caesar, or the most noble Caesar. So we can see that during the 3rd century, emperors basically used their Caesars as just political instruments, reassuring the symbols that suggested a stable dynasty was coming, and it would respect Roman Republican traditions. Of course, nothing of that happened. Heading to the reverse, we have a little bit of imperial propaganda and, frankly, some wishful thinking. We have an image of 2 clasped hands, a very obvious symbol of unity, of good intentions, with the legends Concordia Augustorum, meaning the concord, the fair dealings between the emperors. Considering the dangerous times that Romans were living when this coin was struck, I'm glad the die engraver decided to only show one of the hands of the 2 emperors clasping hands, because I'm pretty sure the other hand would be holding a dagger. Now, as you might be guessing, this was a very dangerous time to be an emperor, but it was also a dangerous time to be a Caesar. So what about when a Caesar died before becoming emperor? That happened many times, and generally this led to some kind of imperial official statement of grief in the name of the would-be emperor, and commemorative coins celebrating the memory of the Caesar were commonly made. Here we have an example. This is a coin issued for Valerian II, the son of Emperor Gallienus, who died in 258 AD. It looks like the poor boy was still a teenager when he was assassinated. So while Gallienus spent his reign rushing from one frontier to the other, trying to solve the endless military crisis of his time, his young son was set up in the Balkans as a kind of a dynastic placeholder, so sort of like the visible presence of the imperial house in a troubled region, while the real emperor was somewhere else, personally leading an army. Valerian died there in suspicious circumstances, under the watchful eye of his military guardian, and ancient writers already hint that politics may have played a part in his sudden disappearance. For a father already under immense pressure, the loss of his heir must have felt like a great blow for Gallienus, particularly considering how tragic his reign was. Like, Gallienus didn't have a single second of peace during his reign. And here he was, forced to bury his son. Now, giving the proper treatment for the dead was very important for the Romans. The Romans had a series of cardinal virtues called the mos maiorum, and some of them were related to religio and pietas. These were the proper following of religious rites and the proper honoring of family members. And he did this to his son. He had him deified. So as we can read here in this coin, we have Divo Caesar Valerianus, so giving the boy a place among the gods as a martyr of the Roman cause. When we head to the reverse, we have the image of a flaming altar. Altars such as these, they were placed at the entrance of temples during ceremonies. A fire would be lit on top of it, and offerings would be burned there. As the ashes of whatever was offered burned and rose to the skies with the hot air, it was said that in this way the offerings were elevated to the gods. So here we have one of such altars with a flame lit on top of it, showing it was being used on Valerian's deification ceremony. And around the design, we have the legends consecratio, meaning the young boy was being consecrated to the gods. Yeah, the 3rd century spared no one, including the rich and powerful. But Rome managed to survive this chaotic century. The current consensus is that the crisis officially ended in 284 AD. Diocletian was the one who finally broke the cycle of bloodshed, for a while at least. So, after decades of emperors rising and falling at sword point, he managed to get a strong enough grip at power that no one managed to, assassinate him. And once firmly placed in power, he tried something new, a division of power no one had ever set up at that point, called the Tetrarchy, meaning the rule by 4. This new imperial college consisted of 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 junior colleagues, subordinate to them, called Caesares. The Augusti were supposed to resign, both of them, together after 20 years of service, opening way for the Caesars to become emperors, to become Augusti, and then they would elect their own Caesars, and the cycle would restart. It was a great idea, but sadly it didn't last for very long. Under this new rule of 4, each one of these men governed their own regions, they had their own armies, effectively creating a 1 versus 3 situation in case any of them just went rogue. And in order to pay the army, each one was able to issue their own coins, like this one we have here, a numus issued under Galerius. This period was marked by huge changes in iconography and how the emperor and the Caesars were seen by the public. The emperor was now openly styled the Dominus, the Lord, a far more authoritarian figure compared to the old first citizen of Augustus. But the system was also built in a sort of internal balance, with each ruler watching and sort of like needing the other. In this world, Caesar was no longer like a promising teenager in training or a little helper of the emperor. He was mostly an experienced commander, a grown man, already holding real power and under, yes, a senior colleague, but still a very powerful figure. So looking at our coin here, Galerius is exactly what Diocletian wanted from his Caesar. An experienced general from the Danubian provinces. He was basically chosen by Diocletian because he considered him an ideal partner to solidify their rule. And during his time as Caesar, Galerius did a good job. He guarded the frontier that was designated to him, he married Diocletian's daughter to solidify their alliance, and he took charge of an eastern war against Persia, winning a decisive victory and solidifying even more this tetrarchy. The tetrarchy also reformed the monetary system, making brand new denominations. This one is called the Numus, and this particular piece was issued between 303 and 305 AD. We can see the very serious portrait of the Caesar, with very simple legends. Maximianus nobilicimus Caesar. I love how the die that was used to strike this coin had a flaw right at the area of his eye, which makes it look like Galerius had a nasty battle scar. And this air of seriousness made perfect sense. He ran his own provinces, he commanded troops, he was supposed to be taken very seriously, and his imagery was meant to be nearly indistinguishable from that of the full emperors. Apart from small differences in the titles or the legends, the portraits are, well, basically indistinguishable really. And this was done on purpose. These impersonalized portraits were meant to show that the Imperial College wasn't meant to be ruled by a single individual man that you knew who he was. It was a larger-than-life entity. And for you, a mere citizen, using this coin, it didn't matter if you didn't know what the emperor looked like. It mattered that you knew you had a lord and you're supposed to obey him. On the reverse, we have a continuation of this authoritarian theme. We have the image of Moneta, with the legends Sacra Moneta Augustorum et Caesarum Nostrorum. The use of the goddess Moneta was quite common during the Tetrarchy. She was the personification of the state's coinage, showing that money was the responsibility of the gods and the Roman people, not just the whim of whoever wore the purple. Which is a bit ironic since every single emperor, including the Tetrarchs, abused the issue of money to steal purchasing power from their people via inflation and uncontrolled creation of money. That's a Roman thing, really. Inflation was rampant during the Tetrarchy, and they tried to control it with measures like the Edict of Maximum Prices. So the use of moneta, of the idea of coinage here, was used to help pass this idea that the reforms were something sacred and necessary. Respecting the emperor's price controls and the value stamped on the coins was presented as obedience to the divinely sanctioned order of Rome. Of course, even with this beautiful metaphor here in the reverse, no one respected the unrealistic maximum prices established by Diocletian, even if the penalty for not complying was death. Everything just moved to the black market, showing this type of centralized control of the economy never worked and probably never will. So, let's keep going forward in time. The Tetrarchy envisioned by Diocletian ended up failing. In its place, the empire was once again ruled by a single emperor, Constantine the Great. With him, we have a new chapter in how the emperor and his Caesars were seen, one in which the emperor was completely connected to the divine. Constantine maintained this part of the public image of the emperor instituted by the Tetrarchy. His public image was sustained by two main pillars: He presented himself as a general. These were still very violent times in which the army was the main power broker of Rome, but crucially, as a man appointed by heavens to rule. From early in his reign, he's linked to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a very popular god amongst the soldiers. Constantine was certainly a sun worshipper, at least in his earlier life, and after his victory at the Milvian Bridge, he slowly transitioned to the Christian god, eventually leading to his conversion, his public conversion to Christianity. If he was that much of a devout Christian, that's a discussion for another day. What matters to us is that this idea of ruling by divine grace was essential to his image as an emperor, and it influenced how his sons, the Caesars, were also shown on coinage. For this time period, we have a small copper phallus showing Crispus, Constantine's eldest son. This coin was issued around 320 AD. Crispus was a fairly capable military commander, and Constantine advertised him as a very competent successor. Yet another divine favor of the gods to the Roman people, an heir as capable as the divine emperor. How nice. And as a Caesar, Crispus was given real command, not just honorary titles. He secured the Rhine frontiers in the early 320s and then led Constantine's fleet to a crucial victory over Constantine's rival Licinius in the Civil War. This gave Crispus a reputation for a great commander, and it explains why his coins often show a very militaristic imagery. Here we can see the Caesar holding a shield on his hand, a spear in front of his body, like if he was in the first line of a battle, and he's wearing his full-body cuirass. The legends are fairly straightforward: Crispus nobilicimus Caesar, and that's nice, he also wears a laurel crown on his head, showing that he had the noble blood of his father. Quite a small regal symbol among so many purely militaristic symbols, but a very important one. And on the reverse, we have more propaganda of how capable Crispus must have been on military matters. We have a couple of captives sitting on the floor with their hands tied to their backs, ready to be sold into slavery. Between them, there's a military standard, a labarum, with an inscription celebrating his vota publica, a public ceremony in which Crispus promised to serve the Roman people for 10 years. Around the design, we have the legends, virtus exerciti, meaning the value, the manliness of the army, yet another little hint at the army as one of the main pillars that supported Constantine's legitimacy. And, well, as you can clearly see, Crispus had everything for a great Caesar and a great future emperor. He had royal pedigree, he had military successes behind him, and a very good public image carefully cultivated as this bright young hope of the empire. But as you might know if you studied Roman history, there was no Emperor Crispus. That's because suddenly it all ended. In 326 he was accused, probably on charges of treason or some tangled scandal at court. He was stripped of all his positions and quietly executed. Some say Crispus was completely innocent, and it was all just a plot organized by Constantine's second wife, Fausta, in order to get rid of Crispus in favor of her own sons. It was likely a plot because Constantine executed Fausta shortly after executing Crispus, in one of the most tragic episodes of this great emperor's life. That was not very Christian of you, Constantine. What about the part of "you shall not kill"? And finally, for the last Caesar of today, we're going for a time after the fall of the Western Empire. Let's go to the Eastern Roman Empire, the eastern half that carried on for another 1,000 years. The Byzantines continued many old Roman traditions, including that of the Caesar as the heir of the emperor. Here we have a coin issued under Heraclius between 632 and 638. This one comes from Alexandria in Egypt. Heraclius made his young son, Heraclonas, Caesar in 632, a point in which he started showing up on coins, alongside the other male members of the dynasty. It's a little bit hard to understand the coin, but the drawings are going to help us. So, at the center, we have the figure of his father, the tallest figure. To the right, his elder son, Constantine. And finally, to the left, we have Heraclonas as a Caesar. Notice that the coin doesn't have any legends. The way the two emperors are distinguished from the Caesar is due to the bearded portraits and the fact they are crowned with crosses, validating their divine right to rule. while Heraclonas has a cross next to him, but not quite on his head, showing he wasn't ruling just yet. It's a pretty rough looking coin because the empire was going through some tough times in the 7th century. During Heraclonas' time, the Byzantines received the initial shock of the first Islamic conquests, losing lots of territories. In fact, they would soon lose Egypt, the place where this coin was made. And as an heir, Heraclonas didn't do much. He was just there to be educated, to be raised the best way as possible so he could one day assume the throne. After Heraclius' death, he would actually be promoted to co-emperor and then briefly rule in his own right. But just like with many other Byzantine emperors, he was deposed and found a very violent death. On the reverse of this piece, a 12 Numi coin, we can see a different philosophy on coin design on the part of the Eastern Romans. They begin adding denominational marks on their coins, basically Greek numerals telling us how much each coin was worth, like our modern coins. In this case, we have the letters iota and beta, representing 10 and 2, so 12 Numi. This wasn't a lot of money back then. You would likely need to hand a few of these at the local tavern to be able to afford a simple meal. And under the denomination, we have a few letters: alpha, lambda, epsilon, sigma, representing Alex or Alexandria, the Mint of Alexandria. It's so interesting to see how some of the traditions of the Western Roman Empire were so deeply ingrained in Roman culture that the East continued using these traditions even centuries after the West had fallen. So here we have it, from the first coins featuring the heirs of the imperial throne under the first emperor, to coins made for Caesars all the way in the early medieval period. So what do you think? Do you have a favorite Caesar? Let us know in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed it, happy collecting, and I'll see you soon. Let me give a special thank you to all of my amazing channel members and Patreons for their generous support. This channel would not be the same without your help. And if you would like to be part of this list, have early access to my videos when they are uploaded to YouTube, and a series of other perks, make sure to check out my Patreon page and my members tab on YouTube. Thank you very much.